So Molly, I feel like we've established over the last couple of episodes that at least Eugenia and I are video game nerds, and Scott is an aspirational video game nerd, though he sadly doesn't have time because of pesky children.
Ugh,
Molly,
what
about you? I feel like you could be a video game nerd.
I have high potential for nerdery. We know this. But I guess this is like how my husband feels when he has to hang out with me and my Congress friends. And like we're just all in on like Congress nerddom. Like I get that. Like it's
but that's your job. That's different than being like a hobby nerd.
A job and a passion.
Yeah,
let's
be clear here.
I feel like we just need to find a congressional video game like Sims Congress, where
where
get
nothing
to,
happens.
You get to decorate your little office where you get moved every 2 years.
Raise funds. You spend half of the time calling to fake donors, and then no legislation ever gets passed. Best game ever.
I don't know. I feel like this could fall in the category of the cozy games. I've been playing Stardew Valley, and like there's the nice music and it's pretty, but then you're just like watering crops and fulfilling people's requests, and you're just like working.
That's true.
So you could
like a manual labor themed game. This is the clutch.
Cozy congressional fundraising.
Yeah.
I think a constituent services. So you're the lonely staffer at the home office back at the district.
Oh my God. This conversation started nerdy and it just got so much worse.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am one of your regular co-hosts, Scott R. Anderson. Thrilled to be back here in the virtual studio with one of my other regular co-hosts, Alan Rosenstein.
Hello.
And while we are quintilless this week, we have brought in two ringers to help us with our conversation about the national security news in what has been a very big week. None other than Lawfare Senior Editor and Brookings Senior Fellow, Molly Reynolds.
Hey, it's good to be here.
And Lawfare Fellow in Technology, Policy Law, and Video Game Ninja, Eugenia Lowstreet. Eugenia, thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me. I have to say, Scott, this time you didn't call us your favorite guests, and I feel bad about it.
I called you ringers. I got called out for having too many favorites last
week,
so I'm trying to vary it up a little bit.
Natalie Orpit is very jealous of being the favorite. She wants to be like the favorite, the prima inter favorites.
Well, Eugenia knows how to play the game right, because she has revealed that not only does she come on the show, she actually listens to the show.
I do.
Something that other people like Molly have said they definitely don't do. So you initially get bumped up, Eugenia. You're our favorite this week.
I will take the grief. It's well deserved here.
Well, we are thrilled to have you back on the show, listener or no, to talk over what has been, I will say it for maybe the third time this month, one of the most historical weeks in national security and national news that we've had on the books, which is kind of ridiculous. I'm thrilled to be here this one to talk over a couple of big developments in national security news, and a couple of big developments that hit a lot of us very personally on our travel plans over the weekend. Beginning with our first topic. Bye, Biden. President Biden made the historic decision to withdraw from the 2024 presidential race over the weekend. He swiftly endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris, who now appears poised to become the Democratic candidate at the party's convention next month. How might Harris be different from Biden both as a candidate, as a president, and what will the change mean for the 2024 race? Topic 2. The crowd strikes back. Countless businesses around the world found their Windows computers disabled this past week due to a faulty update pushed out by the prominent cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike. The consequences continued to ripple out, including waves of canceled and rescheduled flights at numerous major airlines. What can this incident teach us about the security of our computer infrastructure, and are there ways to avoid similar incidents in the future? And topic 3. Netanyahu? Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is scheduled to give his long-awaited speech to Congress later today, but the normally high-profile event has been overshadowed by recent news relating to the 2024 presidential race, potentially mitigating some of its intended effect. What should we expect from Bibi's speech, and how will it impact progress towards a ceasefire in Gaza and U.S.-Israeli relations more broadly? For our first topic, Alan, let me hand it over to you to get us started.
So where to even begin? I mean, I suspect all of our listeners are well aware of what is currently happening in American politics. Joe Biden is not going to be running for re-election. He has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. It seems like virtually every other bigwig in Democratic politics, including most, if not all, of the potential, what would have been the potential frontrunners for the now vacant presidential nomination, quickly endorsed Kamala Harris. I think she's announced that she has confirmed that she has the delegates she needs to clinch the nomination at next month's Democratic convention. And so I think at this point, I think can safely assume that that she is the front runner. I don't even know where to begin. So I guess I'll ask Molly. You're the political scientist. Explain to me what is happening in American politics. Is it true that the Democratic Party is an actual political party and the party decides theory, which maybe you can explain, is for once true?
Sure. So Alan is referring to a school of thought that suggests that, particularly in the actual primary contest phase of a presidential nominating campaign, that ultimately the most important set of actors are not necessarily who the average voter, but a sort of constellation of interests within political parties. So both formal party actors and then also the coalition of interest groups and kind of organized forces that we might think of as associated with a given party's coalition. So, on the Democratic side of the aisle, that would be things like environmental groups and groups that represent women's interests and groups that represent the interests of racial minorities and that sort of thing. And so, I do think that certainly, if not President Biden's decision to step aside, certainly what we've seen in the now 48 hours since he made the announcement in terms of sort of the formal actors in the party really coalescing behind Harris as an alternative, the sort of really significant amount of fundraising that she's been able to do in that period of time. I think that's all that is, I think, illustrative of what it means to have kind of a strong political party as an organization and as an institution. And that is actually many folks have argued, and I would tend to agree, that that's been one of the things that American politics have struggled with in the last decade or so. So this idea that I will credit to a political scientist named Julia Azari, who has argued that we have really strong partisanship in the United States, but not necessarily strong parties. So the idea that it is, and the 2016 nominating contest on the Republican side of the aisle is probably the best case of this, that, the formal institutions, the formal mechanisms of the parties are not nearly as strong, do not have nearly as many formal levers or really informal levers of power as that match kind of the strength of our partisanship in American politics.
Okay, so obviously it's far too early to know exactly how this is going to affect the race. I think there was a broad consensus that Joe Biden was on a path to losing quite badly. That's, of course, the whole reason that he dropped out. So
it may be true that the polling data was suggesting that is what was going to happen. It's not entirely clear that Harris swapping in changes some of those structural dynamics of the race. It may change, but I think a big question is whether what people were unhappy about when they were unhappy about Joe Biden were things related to Joe Biden or things related to the Democrats or to the economy more broadly. The other thing that I would, and this is sort of why I jumped in, is that I actually think the most compelling reason for Biden to have stepped aside is the idea that perhaps he is not up to serving for 4 more years as president. So, if we are thinking about the fact that, he is older and what it takes to be an effective governing force, the fact that may well have been part of what made the decision. And I actually think that's, we can talk about the electoral implications, but I think that's also a really compelling argument that I feel like is getting a little bit overshadowed by the electoral piece. And so I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's a really important part of the story too.
Well, I want to interrupt your interruption to agree with you, but to add one additional part of that as well, which I think
I want people to stop interrupting me.
Alan,
let me interrupt you, Scott.
You're the interrupter who interrupted you. Well, sorry to interrupt you. I gotta finish. I totally agree with what Molly just said about his ability to complete the next 4 terms. But I think a corollary to that, and one that may have had even more pressing motivator, is concern that he wasn't going to be effectively be able to finish this political campaign. Finish it, yes, probably. I don't think people were actually worried he was going to pass away or become incapacitated between now and November. Obviously, things can happen, but doesn't seem reason to think that that's imminent. But the debate concern really was his performance at the last debate drove home this idea that is he in a position to actually be able to deliver public addresses, engage in sparring with rivals when you have another debate already scheduled? And that I think is actually kind of like that, plus the actual capacity to complete the term, if reelected, is kind of the most compelling argument. Polls at this point, I mean, I think most experts have expressed serious doubts as to how much we can garner from the polls this early. Like, a lot of variables can intervene. Certainly the fundamentals right now seem to be problematic for Biden and for the Democrats generally on a polling basis. Some of that might be Biden specific. Some of it may not be. But a lot's going to change between now and election day. And the polling might not be trying to assume the polling today is going to outright determine the inevitable fate of these candidates, I think, is a little premature. So if you were changing this just because you had some loose polling saying Kamala did 1% better than Joe Biden, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. But I do think it does make sense if you say, but she's somebody who's going to be much more effective at delivering a message and frankly focusing the race on Trump and his agenda, which big parts of which are pretty unpopular when you actually dig into the actual issue, the actual for people. And insofar as she's going to be able to deliver that message more effectively, focus criticism on him and respond to that in a way, whereas Biden's age and capacity was becoming its own big distraction, I think that's really where the comparative advantage comes in.
So I'm going to interrupt Scott's interruption of Molly's interruption.
Thank you.
Yes. I mean, I had to. I feel like I had to. I mean, I agree with everything. I just wanted to add another layer that, to me stuck out in, at least what has been happening in the last 48 hours. And I think the fact that Biden stepped down shifted the conversation, right? Like, we are no longer seeing constant coverage of, will he, won't he, is he fit, is he not? And now, it's just, she's doing it. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing, what she's talking about during the rallies, what her speech is about, how her policies, will change or not from Biden. But it just seems some more normal coverage of a electoral race than what we were having after the debate. And I think that's also an important contribution from Biden stepping down. And it's just refocusing the conversation.
I think that, Honey, I think it's a really important point, and we're going to get to that again, I think, when we talk about Netanyahu's visit, because I do think that this is, as Alan said in his intro, a historic thing to happen, and it is overshadowing lots of other, news, in sort of pushing other things off kind of the front burner, including, I will note, continued discussion of the fact that there was an assassination attempt on Donald Trump 10 days ago at this point. And so for better or worse, just the pace of the news cycle, and how unprecedented of a, development this is. I think you're absolutely right. And I think that when we think about sort of possible changes in the direction of the race, one of them could come from just the amount of, attention that she is getting now in a way that is, at least as I can tell, pretty positive. And in a way that, as you point out, Eugenia, Biden wasn't over the past couple of weeks.
Yes. And this is kind of silly and anecdotal, but since Harris, launched her campaign, I think in social media, I've seen a very different coverage. The types of memes that you see of Kamala Harris compared to Biden. Biden's memes were all about him looking confused, and it's oh, you don't understand what's going on. And for her, it's this kind of whimsical, weird phrasing that she had with the coconut tree, but it's all done in a much better spirit, right? It seemed more positive. And I think, again, this is just my algorithm. I don't know how much we can infer from this, but I found it kind of striking.
And one thing actually I did think was interesting looking at a couple of polling, which again, I think we have to take very lightly. But one thing that I thought was a really interesting indicator, which I did not expect at all, is that her name recognition is way below Joe Biden's, and actually way below a lot of the people in the race, like, above like governors and the people who don't really have a national profile yet, but substantially below Joe Biden and below, I believe, what Joe Biden's was when he was vice president even. And that's kind of interesting because at least one variable you look at candidates, as I understand it, going into these races is to what extent are people persuadable on this candidate? To what extent are they already have opinions baked in? Because you're trying to lower name recognition. That can be a virtue because it means it gives you a chance to shape their understanding of perception of you. And if that's being done in a favorable light, which I agree, I think the media coverage and the social media coverage has been pretty favorable. Again, that can be a comparative advantage. I don't know exactly what to attribute that to other than that she's just maybe been a little bit more low key vice president. I think somewhat deliberately, I think a lot of the Biden folks were trying to focus attention on Biden for a lot of the administration and for the campaign to avoid drawing a strong contrast that would make him look older and weaker. But perhaps unexpectedly, that may be playing a little bit in her favor now, as it leaves her much more of a blank slate she can fill in for voters.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point, Scott. I mean, I think a couple other ideas as to why her name recognition might be lower, almost 4 years into her vice presidency. So do you think about what would have otherwise been her biggest introduction to a national audience, which was the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, which had approximately 400 people in it. So the idea that there are just lots, lots
and she also lasted there for 7 days. I mean, it was not great.
There were lots of people competing for national attention, whereas you sort of contrast that with Biden's pretty long national career in a very different media environment. In the run-up to his ultimate selection as the vice president by then Senator President Obama. And so I would speculate that may be part of what's going on. And then I think that your observation about sort of her role in the Biden-Harris administration being a little bit less visible than some other vice presidents have been.
Scott, I want to go back to something that you talked about earlier in the conversation, which is about this question dogging Biden, whether he could finish out, another 4-year term and if he could sort of campaign vigorously. And this has raised questions, I think some from sort of more kind of the trollish side, but also I think they're good faith questions that have been raised about, look, if Biden's not confident that he can do another term, and he's not confident, frankly, maybe more importantly, that he can campaign vigorously and aggressively, why should he or why should the American public be confident that he can finish out this term? I mean, he has a vice president that could step in, that might even be electorally advantageous. I'm not sure if she was campaigning not just as vice president, but as the president. Obviously, that would raise questions of who the vice president would be if he did step down. But, there is someone in line for succession. That's not the issue, right? So it's not a continuity of government problem. I mean, what do you think about the argument that, if Biden isn't energetic or fit enough or whatever you want to say to campaign, he honestly shouldn't be running. He shouldn't be in the White House for the next 6 months, given how much instability and conflict there is in the world right now.
So I think there is a legitimate version of this question, although I think versions of this question also get used for political purposes in pretty, I think, illegitimate ways. But I don't think it really holds together on examination, at least from what we know so far. I mean, I don't think people are seriously concerned about Biden having major cognitive disconnects, right? People are worried about him having a lot of the effects of aging. He's slower. He tires more easily. Conversation becomes a little bit harder. It's not about, huge lapses in judgment, delusions, anything along those lines, which is really what you might worry about somebody who's making important decisions. And I think more fundamentally here is that, frankly, the day-to-day job of being a presidential candidate is way more demanding than the day-to-day job of being president. Neither one's easy, don't get me wrong. But when you're president, you set your own agenda to a substantial extent in terms of time spent doing different activities. You have lots of advisors and senior policymakers to whom you delegate a lot of decision-making authority, some more, some less. You have lots of people who can check your thinking, check your reasoning. And if you are particularly conscious of the fact that you may need a little extra time or may need to spend time thinking about something a little bit more, they can back you up on that. You can use them as a way to check your thinking. And a lot more of the things that become disadvantageous in a presidential campaign, you can control a lot more when you're just doing the duties of the president. And frankly, the president can just step away from the office of the presidency for a long time, and it still functions pretty effectively. How do we know this? Because most presidents run for re-election, and they spend months putting a lot of their time doing anything but governing, instead focusing on a political campaign. By contrast, a political campaign is freaking exhausting. I've worked on a number of political campaigns at fairly low levels, low to medium low levels, and it's freaking exhausting for everyone involved at that level. And then you interact with principals, or you interact with senior staffers, and you see the amount to which they are not sleeping. They are constantly on the road, visiting 3 different states every single weekend, shaking hands, meeting lots of people. It is just a complete marathon, particularly for those last 4 months. And that sort of pressure, that sort of demand, I think is what, in my mind, reasonably drove people to concern that that's going to be too taxing for President Biden, potentially, given that we saw international travel and other factors already contributed to what was an abysmal debate performance. So I think there's a much better argument saying that if you're older, if you are a little bit slower and a little more prone to fatigue, presidential campaigns a lot harder to manage. And for that reason, frankly, dividing the two and having one person being able to focus on the presidency, particularly if they might have some of those comparative disadvantages compared to other people, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things here. So one, to kind of build on Scott's point, I think if we think about sort of the highest profile things we've seen President Biden do since the debate, and think about, for example, the press conference he gave at the end of the NATO summit, where, that's like really firmly in his wheelhouse. He's always been a foreign policy guy, and he's had, unquestioning command of lots of complicated things around the world. So I think, just to again illustrate Scott's point, the other thing I'll say, and Alan sort of alluded to this in the setup to his question, is that I personally am very skeptical that if President Biden, stepped down from the presidency and Vice President Harris ascended to the presidency, that the Republican-controlled U.S. House of Representatives would confirm a new vice president between now and January 20th. And while yes, if something were to happen to then President Harris, while the vice presidency is vacant, we would not be president-less. We would move on to having the Speaker of the House ascend to the presidency, which allows me to momentarily get up on one of my soapboxes, which is to say that the Speaker of the House should not be third in line for the presidency. That's that is just, I think, an anachronism of our current political and constitutional system.
Really? Wait, who should it be?
I mean, if we're going to have something that goes past the vice president, then I think we should go into the cabinet secretaries. I just think that having an officer of the legislative branch who is selected, in the case of the Speaker of the House, by the members of the House of Representatives, that's how you get that job. I'm just not the biggest fan of that in that position being in the constitutional line of succession. And then the president pro tem in the Senate, who's next in line after the Speaker of the House, is usually the longest serving member of the majority party, though that's not a firm rule. When Patty Murray, who's the current president pro tem, ascended to that job, she was not actually the longest serving Democrat in the Senate. And so the idea that we have these positions in the line, particularly again, the Senate president pro tem, who's just kind of there's a little bit of fuzziness around how you get that job. I would prefer to remove officers of the legislative branch from the line of succession. But now you've got one of my hot takes.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, of course, is the vice president is also an officer of the legislature. So the intermixing runs deep.
Oh,
it runs deep, Molly.
But what of the vice president's functions are legislative versus executive? Alan?
Oh no! Don't do this. I see what you did there.
We may have gone on a tangent, guys.
And I don't like it. Okay, so I think we should probably also talk about the other side here, because I think that is worth thinking about, and sort of how we should expect a presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, to prosecute both figuratively and in some senses quite literally the case against Donald Trump. She obviously got her start as a prosecutor in San Francisco. I think she was the DA there. I think that's where her career began in sort of high profile public service. This, of course, was very not good for her in 2020, when the whole Kamala is a cop thing did not make her popular with the Democratic Party, given what was happening at the time. I think today in 2024, it's actually potentially a big asset to her, because she can draw the contrast quite well between her, a prosecutor, and Donald Trump, a convicted felon and indictee in multiple states. At the same time, though, it does strike me that there's a bit of a trap here where if she goes too hard on the, hey, you should vote for me because Donald Trump is a felon, that might sort of harm her chances with sort of some of the swing voters that she needs who perhaps care less than the, inside the Beltway elites like us, or at least I'm kind of virtually an inside the Beltway elite coming from Minnesota, who maybe care less about that stuff and care much more about sort of kitchen table issues. So I'm curious if folks have thoughts on how she should frame this, right? Should it just be about, hey, vote for the Democrats because we're the party of the little people, kind of the standard Democratic line, or to kind of double down on the Trump is a threat to democracy, he is a felon, I'm a prosecutor, and help me prosecute him into political oblivion.
So I don't know if you all watched her address yesterday, the rally in Wisconsin, but I actually thought that she struck a very good balance of exactly this, Alan, during that address. She mate it clear. She compared her own record to Trump's. She was drawing, line to line. I know Donald Trump's type was, I think, a pretty good catchphrase, for her. She was clear about what he's done and how that is, an offense, and how she has prosecuted people who have done those things. And then she moved on. To talk about gun control or reproductive freedom, which I think are actual policies that have less to do with Trump and have more to do with this is what you can expect looking forward from my presidency. I don't know if this is kind of a naive read, but I thought it was good for her to say, look, this is the other option, but also here's me when we look to the future.
Yeah, I'm not really sure it's an either or question, Alan, in part because I do think that one of the most, sort of just in terms of broad public opinion, some of the points at which Donald Trump has been least popular since his rise to national prominence have been times when he was leading a Republican Party that was trying to do things that were wildly unpopular, like repeal the Affordable Care Act. And so the idea of sort of both making it about Trump, but also making it about this is an interesting conversation to have in light of what to me has been a surprising relevance of Project 2025, which I think you guys talked about a couple weeks ago. But like that as a concept, the fact that people are actually talking about that document, the idea that it's both, Trump and Trumpism as a threat, but then also like, what does that mean in the policy context? And what would it mean if voters elected Donald Trump and one or both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans? What could they actually do? What would they try to do? And some of that, again, is the kind of authoritarian impulses. And some of it is the, real consequential policy changes that they would try to make.
And more fundamentally, to the extent Trump has vulnerabilities, like issues with identity, issues with how he treats different groups of Americans, rhetorically and actually, along with a lot of other policy ideas, are big vulnerabilities for him. And she is in a uniquely advantageous position to take advantage of some of those. She's also going to be, frankly, the target of probably a lot more kind of vicious ire, which is going to be, I think, difficult to get through some of this campaign, not necessarily from Trump directly, but from other people kind of in the ecosystem. But because of that, in part, she has a lot of credibility because of who she is and her identity, the fact she's a woman of color and a prosecutor and has all sorts of kind of interesting aspects to her background professionally and personally. It gives her a lot of credibility to make those points. And I think that's a huge asset, not a liability. It can't be all you talk about. That's certainly true. But it means be much more effective in the limited time you can spend talking about it. And that's a huge deal. Much more effective than Joe Biden arguing with Trump about their golf scores, which is where we ended up during the debate, right? This is a way that she can attack it consciously with a lot more credibility and a lot more, I think, effectively. And I think actually that's really an interesting note on this is that like the main hit point against her that I've seen floating around because it keeps recurring in different accounts, particularly from kind of conservative media figures about describing this as that, accusing her of having committed a coup, of doing this, basically of being undemocratically elected, which I think is a ludicrous line for people to take critically against him when she's running against Donald Trump. Because I don't know why you want to talk about coups more often, if your candidate is most famous for recently trying to perpetrate one. So for much more transparently than Kamala Harris might have by any conceivable argument. So it really struggles, I think, and shows how hard in some ways it is for folks to attack, or at least so far they haven't really found, I think, a line of attack that's going to survive in the medium to long term. And that's going to be a problem for Republicans. Well, talking about reboots, let us go to a new type of reboot, or perhaps a cause for a need for reboots all around the country this past weekend, where businesses of various stripes and colors, not just the United States, really around the world, who rely upon Windows computers, suddenly found them unable to use said computers for a variety of purposes, whether managing flights or checking people out for their businesses or doing their day-to-day jobs, whether they're government employees or white-collar workers around the country, as a result of a single error by the prominent cybersecurity company CrowdStrike. They appear to have pushed out into Windows computers en masse, triggering collapses left and right that people are still digging out of. It's an incredibly complicated web of events that led this to happen. Maybe not that complicated, but it's computers and pipes and wires and stuff, so it sounds complicated. Alan, why don't I hand it over to you to walk us through exactly what we know happened at this point and what we might not know?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty interesting. So basically, CrowdStrike is one of these cybersecurity firms, and you can think of them as like really fancy, antivirus. Right? We all had McAfee and Norton, right, installed in our computers 15 years ago. And CrowdStrike's Falcon program is kind of a more advanced version of that. The way it works is, and here I need to introduce sort of an important concept in computer architecture of the kernel versus everything else. So basically, the way modern computers work is that there is a small, very important piece of low-level software called the kernel. And that kernel basically controls all the basic operations of the computer. So it deals with all the hardware, and it also deals with providing access and resources to other applications that want to use the computer. So most of the applications that run on a computer run in what's called user space. So, your web browser, your word processor, your video player, whatever. And what user space is it's a restricted set of permissions for these applications. So basically, if your, word processor wants to, or your web browser wants to have access to your monitor to display some content, it doesn't literally talk to your monitor and the hardware in the monitor directly. It goes to the kernel and says, hey, kernel, I would like to do something to the monitor. The kernel then goes to the monitor and says, okay, monitor, do the thing. And the reason all this happens is a couple of fold. First, it makes sure that different applications on your computer don't have access to things that they shouldn't have access to. That's a really important security principle. It also makes sure that if an application crashes, only the application crashes. It doesn't take down your entire system. And that's why, if your web browser crashes, your computer doesn't usually also crash. Now, the way that this CrowdStrike Falcon software works is that it actually works at the kernel level. It doesn't work like normal, antivirus or malware at the application level in the user space. And that is because CrowdStrike wants full access to your computer to make sure that it can defend against all these threats. Now, basically, that's fine, except that, of course, if CrowdStrike crashes, then it takes your kernel down. And when the kernel goes down, your computer panics and does the blue screen of death and requires you to reboot. Now, the way Windows manages this is that for anything that wants to run on the kernel level, Windows has like a very interesting and long process for certifying that this application, usually called a kernel driver, is good and won't break your system. And in fact, it did, certify this CrowdStrike software as, compatible and stable. So does this mean that this is Windows' fault? Well, not exactly. So the way that CrowdStrike works is that although it has this one driver that is certified by Windows, the way it keeps its antivirus and malware protection up to date, because every day there are potentially new threats, is it also sends a bunch of kind of files to user computers that the actual CrowdStrike application reads from to update. And those files are not themselves certified by Microsoft. And that's where you can have big problems. What appears to have happened in this case was that in one of these updates of the files, CrowdStrike sent a empty file, right? This is like the dumbest error imaginable. It basically sent a file that looked like a file, but actually had 0 bytes. So when the Falcon kernel driver tried to access that file to, update its suite of things it protected against, it saw a 0-byte file and freaked out, and then the computer restarted. But the problem then is that the computer restarts, the CrowdStrike device driver at the kernel level is loaded up again, it then rereads the file is the 0-byte file, it freaks out, and this happens over and over and over again. And because CrowdStrike made this mistake, and not only that, sent it out to everyone all at once without doing any testing, now you have all these computers that are stuck in this infinite loop. And to fix them, you have to do all this manual stuff where you have to boot the computer into safe mode, find the specific file that was faulty, delete it. And that's fine, except that there are millions of computers affected. A lot of the people using those computers are not IT professionals, might not have access to it. It gets even worse because a lot of these computers are also encrypted using Microsoft's BitLocker encryption service, and that causes issues. So it's a big cluster. And I think the real question is, how could CrowdStrike make such a basic mistake and then not catch it before pushing it out to the entire world? That is the real kind of insane, I think, feature of the story.
So in short, wires and stuff.
Yep, in short, wires and stuff.
Pipes.
That's good. Perfect.
Did not everyone find this as riveting as I did? I think it's just so interesting how this works.
Alan,
I had to fight the
did.
entire time you said kernel. that was my main takeaway.
Okay. You know what? We pride ourselves on wonkiness on this podcast, and I'm not going to not just because we're talking about computers.
No, I appreciated the technical, detailed explanation.
Yeah, I think that was actually very useful. And yeah, let me come to you on this question that Alan posed, which I agree is kind of the central one. But let me break it up kind of into 2 pieces, right? We have an entity, a prominent, important, well-paid, wealthy entity, CrowdStrike, that made a mistake. Very fair question to ask. How do they make that mistake? And what can they do better? And how big a problem is that? But then we saw this mistake get replicated in a broader system. That is a system that CrowdStrike is not itself responsible for. Not entirely, anyway. A lot of it is a result of market effects. A lot of it is a result of the fact that all the other reasons people choose to use people because it's easier to use something familiar, and Windows adopts certain security protocols, and Windows has set up the system that allows companies like CrowdStrike to pursue actions like this. How big a problem is this for that latter system as well, which strikes me as a much more systematic vulnerability that would be of concern to policymakers, among others? So
that's a good question. I do agree with Alan that the central question is, how did this even happen, right? I think there should be an internal investigation about how this happened. What are the internal controls? How is it that they had the faulty file, they did not test it, and then just released it to everyone at once? The fact that it was not released in batches it just seems kind of a sequence of basic mistakes that is hard to understand. It's also, kind of a particular situation. So I think that's important on the one hand. And we have seen some concern about monoculture, about what this means for competition, what we should do about it. I think Congress is asking the CEO to come testify. The Washington Post has the headline is Congress is ramping up oversight of the global CrowdStrike outages. It's also interesting to note that CrowdStrike is on 1% of Windows machines, approx, right? 1% is not it's not monoculture, I wouldn't say. It's the fact is critical services rely on CrowdStrike. The fact was a lot of these important companies, the airlines, depended on it. So that 1% is actually quite important. How do you fix it? I don't know. What the right, policy response is, I don't know. I worry a little bit about any backlash that tells us, let's just not have any third party services. We just need to close down, because then you're just perpetuating the monoculture, I would say. Alan, do you think that's an accurate read?
Yeah, I don't think the answer is to shut down third-party services. I mean, it's just to regulate in some way, either through normal regulation or after the fact litigation and liability, the huge negative externalities, right, that come from just unbelievably shitty software management. I mean, it is insane what CrowdStrike did. There are well-developed methodologies. There's a thing called canary deployment, where, for example, before pushing a critical update out to everyone, you push it out to a small group of people, right? It's like the proverbial canary in the coal mine idea. And then you expand it out. There are all ways of doing this. I think one thing that's really interesting is, what is the litigation after this going to be? My understanding from the standard CrowdStrike term of service is that when you buy this product, you waive your right to get any compensation for disruption beyond what are called fees paid, which is to say the price of the product. So you can get a refund, but that's not what people want. There's an interesting question whether or not with its enterprise customers, who probably demand bespoke terms of service, what compensation of CrowdStrike might owe. But this is the sort of thing that potentially should get a company to pay billions of dollars. I mean, this should be a potential existential litigation risk. And so I agree that the solution should not be you never have third-party services. I'm not sure how much I trust Microsoft in principle more than anyone else, but maybe you shouldn't have CrowdStrike, right? Maybe CrowdStrike has shown that it is not responsible. I mean, what we really need to know is not just could a procedure happen in CrowdStrike, but what is the company culture that allowed the systems in place to exist such that something like this could happen, right? I mean, is this a Boeing story, for example, where a company that, used to actually really care about quality ultimately over a period of years stopped caring about quality, and then its product suffered? I mean, it's the management story, I think, inside CrowdStrike that's going to be as important as the technical story.
So I think it's also interesting to look into why did this happen on Windows computers and it didn't happen on Linux, or it didn't happen on Mac computers, right? And that is because there's quite an interesting history for why Windows has to allow kernel access to companies like CrowdStrike. This is, not my original research. There's I thought, really good review of this on Stratechery this week. And it explains how a few years back, when Microsoft wanted to close access to the kernel, litigation and an agreement in Europe led to them having to have it open. And then when there was a change, in the technology and other companies were allowed to close it, because of the terms of this agreement, Windows didn't. And so maybe, that's also something to consider, how we can kind of update these understandings that come from years back about what is secure and what is not, and not just keep it in, well, this was fixed, because of competition, this was solved back then, and then we never revisit it.
So I think that feeds into another policy reaction I saw that I thought was interesting, which is none other than our own future Vice President J.D. Vance's favorite federal regulator, Lena Khan, of the Federal Trade Commission. On Twitter, shortly after this incident happened, raised the point that this sort of systemic risk is a product of the concentration of production in too few hands, essentially. And she ties it to a bunch of other cases. I don't know whether she's saying exactly it's CrowdStrike that is a concentration of cybersecurity production in too few hands, or Windows and Microsoft's hands being I suspect it's more the latter than the former, but maybe a little bit of both. But setting aside kind of the industry specific, like factual nature of this, is there kind of a logic here? In that, particularly in, the cybersecurity digital domain, where you implement things with incredible rapidity in a way that was not the case for, conventional manufacturing, things like that. Is there a real risk to having too much homogeneity? And then what do you do when you're dealing with a company like Microsoft that is essentially a huge industry provider, sets up the infrastructure on which so much other parts of the industry rely? Because I suspect a big consideration behind the terms and the settlement Eugenia described, saying that Microsoft had keep access to key parts of its infrastructure was in part a response to competition concerns. The fact that if they were to close that off, they would be closing off access to competitors. But so we end up with this weird hybridized model where huge parts of our infrastructure are in common and look the same and potentially subject to the same systematic vulnerabilities. And we have to keep them open to those vulnerabilities because we're worried about crowding out too many other people from being able to compete within the systems that these aspects of technology help set up. Molly, I don't know if you thought about this at all. I know you have looked at, think frequently about regulation in the context of how Congress approaches this and have followed Congress's challenges in addressing any sort of technology, really, from a regulation perspective. Is there an angle to this? Like, is there a policy-related concern about how to strike the balance? And is it a legislative fix, regulatory fix, an industry fix? Like, where does this slot in? I don't know if you have a sense of that at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a great sense of like where the right lever of power, if there is a regulatory fix. I do think it's interesting to have watched kind of the governmental response to this. So you do have a number of folks on Capitol Hill in Congress saying, as I think Alan mentioned before, like we need to have hearings on this. We need to bring in the CEO of CrowdStrike. You mentioned Lena Khan, another very loud voice on social media, around what's happening is, the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, who has, been, talking a lot about, what recourses are actually available to, airline passengers whose travel, was disrupted, a group, among which I count myself, unfortunately. But I think one of the sort of really interesting meta points about this is like, this is the kind of thing that, average people encounter and think like, why isn't the government doing anything about this? Obviously, in the airline context, only a subset of Americans fly, but it is the middle of the summer. It is the time that a lot of people fly. There is a very specific, piece of so for reasons I don't at all understand, Delta has been much more affected by this than other airlines. And one of their responses to that was to suspend their unaccompanied minor travel. So if you have an unaccompanied minor who went somewhere on Delta, they cannot return. They can't. Delta has said that you cannot fly. They will not fly any unaccompanied minors. And they've extended this sort of blackout at least once, perhaps more than once. And so this is sort of the sort of thing that people look at the government and say, like, why can't you fix this? Like, what is the problem? I know, again, personally, I was supposed to be on an airplane where we had 2 pilots, and then we had 3 flight attendants, and we couldn't fly because we needed a 4th flight attendant. And like, that's what prevented our plane from leaving. And so this is the sort of thing that like can make people just kind of mad at the level of government regulation. Even if there's all kinds of like really good reasons why that regulation is in place. Like, this is the sort of thing that turns people into like angry libertarians about this sort of thing. And then,
or just get into planes flying wherever they goddamn well please. Exactly.
Or like more consequentially. And, Alan has done some work on, sort of cyber concerns in the healthcare context, but that's a whole other, as best as I've read, the sort of persistence of the disruptions, major health systems did not, last as long as, say the one at Delta. But again, like this interdependence of systems and all the stuff that we've been talking about does have real consequences for real people. And when I think, people encounter these sorts of disruptions, they do ask, why isn't the government fixing this? Like, what can they do so this never happens again?
Well, so there is a very clear, section of this that the government can act. And it's, to Alan's point, is generating the incentives for these companies not to make this type of mistakes. And I think we see that with, the discussion that the Biden and Harris administration has started on software liability, on security by design, on kind of starting to create those expectations that you can't just be glib about security when you're designing software, and it needs to be life cycle concern. So there's that. So far, everything is kind of voluntary. Everything is a conversation. There is no actual software liability model. We at Lawfare have an entire, an entire project focused on that with different models being proposed. But, when it comes to the concentrate, like, what is the answer? Is it about, making sure that when you're acquiring systems, you're building in redundancy with your purchases? Is it only so many computers can rely on one cybersecurity company just in case one of them has a failure and then not everything goes down? Should the government be dictating who buys which services?
A fair question.
I mean, I don't know. Recorded Future had an article and they shared some Gartner data. It shows that CrowdStrike controls 15% of the market for endpoint protection tools. And it's the second after Microsoft, which covers about 40% of the market. So, are we just going to say this is your market cap? There's only so many services, too many airlines depend on CrowdStrike. So now all the other airlines need to go buy McAfee. How do you envision the role of the government in fixing that? Or if that even needs fixing?
It's interesting.
Later today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will address a joint meeting of Congress in a bid to rehabilitate his image in the US and back home. The visit has been controversial since the get-go, and several Democrats plan to skip the address. One of the Democrats to miss out will be Vice President Harris, who will not preside over the Senate chamber, although reporting indicates that she will meet Netanyahu at another point during his visit. Netanyahu also has plans to meet separately with both President Biden and former President Trump. And while Netanyahu's visit is partially eclipsed by the historic domestic news in the US, recent developments are likely to make it a strained time for him here. Last week, the International Court of Justice issued a non-binding opinion calling Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories unlawful and called on it to end and for settlement construction to stop immediately. That decision came a day after the Israeli parliament overwhelmingly voted to reject Palestinian statehood, calling it an existential danger to the state of Israel. So I want to go, Molly, to you, just to get a sense of what the congressional mood is right now. I think Netanyahu's visit was kind of hyped by the Republicans and maybe kind of dreaded by the Democrats since it was announced. And given the vote in the Israeli parliament last week, it kind of seems like Netanyahu is also driving that wedge in, confirming this divide. So given everything that's happening, is this still a big deal? What's Congress feeling?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So this visit has been in the works for a while. I think it was sort of at least tentatively scheduled, at least once before now. And this is obviously when it is actually, happening. I do think that, and so I want to be clear, it is a big deal. It is certainly a big deal security wise. I was actually on Capitol Hill just before, this recording, and the level of security, is pretty significant. Beyond what you ordinarily see, even for some sort of high-profile event like a State of the Union. Lots of fencing, lots of extra police. So not just Capitol Police, restricted access to spaces both inside the buildings, outside the buildings that usually are freely open to the public. So all kinds of stuff. So it is a big deal. And there is notable congressional opposition to Netanyahu appearing. By last count, or the last count I saw, was about 50 members, mostly Democrats, though not exclusively. Thomas Massey of Kentucky has also said that he is not interested in being used as a prop, and so will not be attending either. But mostly Democrats who are not attending the speech, including some pretty high-profile people, Nancy Pelosi, Dick Durbin, Patty Murray, who, as I mentioned before, is the Senate President pro tem, so would ordinarily be sitting next to the Speaker for something like this, declined to do that. So we have Ben Cardin, who is the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who will be doing it instead. But I think because of everything else going on in American politics, that this has, a little bit of the wind has been taken out of the sails for most members of Congress around this. There are There are, I believe, some meetings going on around like meetings with families of hostages who are still being held by Hamas and that sort of thing. But I think that if this were happening in a somewhat different political context, it would be politically a bigger deal than I think it has ended up being.
Yeah, and I'll note the observation about these families of hostages or people who were held hostage are now deceased coming here. It's really actually even more than they're just here doing separate meetings. There's actually an active counter-programming effort underway. I heard a number of these folks interviewed on NPR this morning. It was a really fascinating conversation, making the point that they're highly, highly critical of Netanyahu. Remember, the hostage families have become a major political liability, major opposition force to Netanyahu and the current government that he heads, in part because they have been thus far really dragging their feet on reaching any sort of agreement on the release of the surviving hostages. And that has become, in a way, one of a handful of really, really hot debates in Israeli domestic politics right now. And the folks at least interviewed on NPR, but I have no reason to think they're not representative of at least a good portion of these folks, said, I'm traveling here to do counter-programming to underscore that Netanyahu doesn't represent the Israeli public on this particular issue or the Israeli state, and that a relationship with Israel doesn't extend to a relationship with Netanyahu. That's pretty striking a move by a group as sympathetic and frankly as politically potentially influential as the families of hostages. I mean, the hostages have been a recurring talking point for American politicians of all political stripes for good reason, for weeks and months now, for 6 months now, if not longer. And so, it is going to be hard for Netanyahu to strike out very aggressively when he's got that sort of really, really compelling counter-programming happening that is reaching the highest levels. Those same people are the same statement, I believe, that said that Biden and Harris were meeting with Netanyahu also noted they're meeting with these families as well. And so it means that this is not the kind of bully pulpit Netanyahu might have hoped it was a few months ago when he accepted this invitation and perhaps kind of engineered it, where he was going to be able to single-handedly kind of call out rivals in the American political system like he did during the Obama administration. Instead, it looks like this is going to be a much more complicated venture that may not have the same payoff for him, I think.
So connected to that point, Scott, what do you think Netanyahu is actually trying to or hoping to achieve during this visit? A lot of the coverage that I read, seemed to indicate this is a PR move. This, is not really tied to any particular reason. It's more like he's trying to rehabilitate his image. He's trying to become a stronger statesman or whatever. But, it just doesn't seem like it's going to go that way. And if anything, it just seems to be undermining him a little bit. What's in it for him now?
It's a good question to ask what the substance of the speech will be. I mean, normally if you have a big address like this, you want there to be some sort of deliverable, either recently acquired or forthcoming that you can announce, to basically mark the occasion, to show like I'm using this to really demonstrate something that supports my bigger case. He has this Knesset vote that happened last week where a coalition rejected the idea of ever agreeing to a Palestinian state. I don't think that's something is useful for him to talk about. He may talk about in the context, I have domestic constraints. There are limits to what Israel itself wants to do, not just me.
Can we pause on that actually for a second? I mean, that Knesset vote, I feel like that Knesset vote is a bigger deal than perhaps I think has been appreciated. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics. I don't know how much that Knesset vote is performative or binding sort of on itself politically. I don't know whether this Knesset is particularly more right wing and that might change. But let's be honest, right? I mean, right now, Israel's most credible response, and maybe we can also get into the ICJ decision. I'm very curious, Scott, what you think about that, as our international law person. I mean, right now, Israel's most credible response to claims that it is a occupying apartheid state is to say, look, the Israel-Palestine process is complicated. It needs time to come up with a workable, durable two-state solution so that, you have two people on one land, but they can each have their own state and national self-determination. If Israel's response, is, well, we just don't care. All of, historic Palestine is ours. And we're obviously not going to have a right of return because we want to remain a Jewish state and that demographic is important, then, I mean, whatever moral credibility Israel has is gone. And so again, I don't know how seriously to take this Knesset rejection of there ever being a Palestinian state. I mean, maybe the sort of thing that, there isn't until there is, as part of a comprehensive peace deal. But it seems very bad. And I don't know why Netanyahu thinks that it is in his benefit to have such a vote in the Knesset. But maybe I'm missing something.
It's all good questions. I mean, I think my guess is that he was trying to put folks in a difficult position in the Knesset. It's very much a domestic politics move by forcing Benny Gantz and others to take a position on this controversial issue, which has been at the hub of a lot of U.S. and global policy towards Israel and Palestine for a very long time. Remember, this is the fundamental precept of the two-state solution that remains technically at the core of U.S. policy. And the Israeli parliament just rejected it. It's worth noting, I think there were only 69 votes, 70 votes recorded out of 120. So I actually don't know what happened with the remainder. Maybe people were abstaining. But that's both for or and against. So I want to see a bigger picture of exactly what the dynamics were around this vote. But I do think it's notable, but it's also not that surprising. I mean, both Palestinians and Israelis, from public opinion numbers, from statements by elites, they've all turned away from the idea of the two-state solution being a realistic prospect a long time ago. The Palestinians just don't believe anybody actually is working towards this, and Israelis don't think it's workable. That's not universally true, but it's a result of the fact that process, whatever it was, the two-state process, really had been moribund for decades at this point. It hadn't made any signs of progress. Was being openly repudiated in a lot of ways, at least by a lot of people's views by the Israeli government in terms of pursuing settlements and a bunch of other items that seemed inconsistent with the idea of working towards a resolution in a two-state solution. And so the idea has really dwindled. That doesn't mean it's dead. The United States very much has reiterated that we support this. And it's hard for the United States and others in the international community not to, because if you don't embrace the idea that we are in a transitional mode that will lead to a two-state solution, then it's really hard to justify how the Israelis are treating the Palestinians, because the Palestinians are effectively second-class citizens. I'm talking about the Palestinians in the occupied territories, not within, Israeli Arab citizens, but they don't have votes. They are subject to lots of economic and social controls. Lots of things that wouldn't be consistent with how states are supposed to treat people who permanently live there. The only reason that's acceptable is because, these are temporary security measures until for an occupied population that eventually is going to get its own state back. If you abandon that concept, then what's the end state? What's the justification for doing that? That's the difficult situation that Israel and Israeli leaders, and frankly, a lot of the Israeli public just doesn't seem to grasp that without the two-state solution, even if a distant one, the current status quo is really not going to be sustainable, I suspect, for a lot of Americans, a lot of Europeans, a lot of people around the world. And the Democratic Party platform, it's worth noting, in 2020 made that express. They said, we need to see a commitment to a two-state solution, or we, otherwise we have to start thinking about what the rights of these people mean in something other than that. I forget the exact language they used, but it was not that subtle. It was very much a nod toward the idea that two-state solution is necessary because otherwise the status quo is unsustainable. So the one thing that Netanyahu can get out of this is, again, he can say, this isn't just me, guys. This is really how Israelis feel. This is how Benny Gantz, like somebody else who is an opposition leader, a centrist one, but an opposition leader to him, feels about this. And so it's not just me being hard up in terms of not being willing to make concessions in this regard for the day after scenario in Gaza, for example. It's Israelis generally. And he may be right about that. Doesn't mean the Israeli views can't be changed, either, persuaded or just forced to make concessions. But right now, that's going to be a big fundamental obstacle, is that I think a lot of Israelis are just not on board with a lot of what the international community thinks is a just and reasonable and appropriate outcome for the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, let alone what the Palestinians think.
I mean, they might not be on board, but at some point they're going to lose American support. I mean, if there's, I just want to take what you said and make it a little sort of crisper, because you're more polite than I am. I mean, if Israel abandons the two-state solution, right? If it even abandons the pretense of that, what the hell is the United States doing at that point? Right? I mean, at that point, it's just very hard to see what the strategic interest of the United States is in supporting Israel. Right? I mean, the whole premise has been Israel is the one democracy in the Middle East, right? That's been the whole idea, right? If it abandons the two-state solution, it is just no longer that. And I just don't know how you get around that fact.
I think that's a reasonable solution. Again, I do think that is closer to what at least the Democratic Party platform 2020 said. I don't actually know what the platform says this year. The platform actually, I guess, hadn't been finalized technically this year.
Yeah. And to be clear, like, you don't have to be a Jamal Bowman to think this, right? Like the whole point is that, like, this is not the sort of far left progressive critique of Israel. This is the normie democratic deal, right? Has always been that, you know, aid to Israel and the sort of ironclad support has to be contingent on the two-state process.
I mean, I guess one question is to sort of take this back to where we started the episode. Even if that's true for a Democratic president and a Democratic majorities in Congress, is it also true for a Republican president and Republican majorities in Congress? And will this have the same consequences for U.S. policy if, say, President Trump is reelected, and we have Republican majorities? Do they feel the same way as you just described, sort of the normie consensus, Alan?
I mean, in the short term, probably not, right? And so in the short, I mean, this is why Netanyahu is praying for Trump to win. Obviously, in the short term, it helps him. But, you know, the issue is once you have thoroughly polarized and partisanship wise, that's not a verb, partisanized, politicized, right? The U.S.-Israeli relationship. That is, again, in the short term, may be good for Israel or may be good for Netanyahu if Trump wins, but in the long term is an absolute disaster. Look, I'm not saying anything that Thomas Friedman hasn't been screaming for the last decade. I just, for whatever reason, me personally, and maybe this is my naivete, and I'm also not Israel expert, but for me personally, the Knesset vote was just it was a more abrupt and kind of shocking wake up call about the current state of Israeli domestic politics than I have had in a very long time. And again, I think if you are someone who is more attuned to this issue, it is not surprising. But for me, and I'm using myself here as the kind of avatar of the normie Democrat, it is quite striking. And that is why I keep harping on it as a much bigger deal that I think has been oddly undercovered in U.S. media. And again, I think it's largely been undercovered because, like, there are like 17 other world historical things happening right now, which is to your point earlier, Amali, but I'm having trouble getting over it.
Well, and I do think this may well feed into the potentially mistaken strategic logic that led to Netanyahu pursuing this address that is going to come this afternoon. I suspect his logic for doing it on the international level to some extent was to signal to both to say internationally, I may be a hard ass and people don't like the fact that I, including the Biden administration, don't like some of the positions I'm taking in regard to Gaza. But the American people, and particularly the American Congress, is still behind me. Because every prior address, he's gotten a very, very friendly bipartisan reception. I think he was likely expecting something similar because Democratic Party leadership, lots of Democrats still very strongly pro-Israel, lots of Democratic voters strongly pro-Israel, hesitant to move away from that.
He is, in fact, coming at the invitation of both the Democratic and Republican congressional leadership. There's a lot of questions about whether that's a smart move on the Democrat side
I wonder how Chuck Schumer feels about
maintaining the
this.
Internal politics of their respective caucuses. But yes, just to make sure that it's clear.
But what's interesting about this, I think, is really interesting, and I don't know whether this played into Schumer and Jeffries' decision to do this or not, whether they knew this was the outcome or this was unexpected, is that Netanyahu is straight up not getting the reception he's gotten or anything close to it. When you have lots of prominent, Democrats skipping the address, including the former speaker, Nancy Pelosi, that's a bad sign. That changes the signal from the American people are behind me, Israel, to, hey, Israelis, you know who's behind me? One party of the American people and some other folks. And by the way, it's the party of Donald Trump, somebody who's a very strong friend of Israel, something Netanyahu has not been afraid to lean into on a lot of fronts, but who I think a lot of people still recognize is a controversial figure for a variety of other reasons, including that he sometimes affiliates people with things that are pretty horribly anti-Semitic. It's not the sort of domestic picture that I think Netanyahu wanted to send. So I'm really curious to see what comes out of this, because I think the outcome is going to be a much more troubling message, even for Israelis, than Netanyahu might have anticipated, because it's a sign that the U.S.-Israeli relationship is really not what it used to be and is being pushed in a much more politicized direction by Netanyahu's actions. And that is not what most Israelis want, I suspect. Well, folks, that is all the time we have for today. But this would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come. Alan, what do you have for us this week?
Well, yeah. So since Quinta's not here, I guess I'm going to be in her place to be sort of highbrow object lesson. I have like a book of literary fiction that I'm suggesting of all things. So Jeffrey Eugenides, pretty well-known American author of The Virgin Suicides and Middlesex, neither of which I have read, though I would really like to now. Published in 2011, his latest book, it hasn't published anything since then, called The Marriage Plot. And it's a fun, short, kind of small world book about three recent college grads in the early 1980s and their kind of fun love triangle. The title refers to one of my favorite genres in fiction, which is the kind of Jane Austen, George Eliot marriage plot, right? A book all about sort of these fun love triangles, which ends in everyone getting married. And the book is sort of about that and kind of a meta commentary in its own sort of funny version of it. It's just a really lovely book. Like, I don't know what to say much more about it. But I really enjoyed it. It kind of spins out for a while and then really sticks the landing in the last 15 pages in a way that I thought was very impressive, which is always something I appreciate. So, it's his least well-known, book. But I think it should be better known. And, now I'm going to go read his other books and report back.
I haven't read The Virgin Suicides actually, but I think Middlesex is amazing. One of the best books I've ever read and highly, highly recommend that. Marriage Plot I remember enjoying, but I had read it just after I read Middlesex and I was disappointed by the comparison, even though I enjoyed it. So maybe that means like Middlesex.
My understanding is that it's a much, much smaller book, kind of in every respect. So I look forward to reading Middlesex and having my mind like totally blown to see like how much bigger sort of he can write. But Middlesex is on its own terms, I think, a really nice book. I mean, sorry, The Marriage Plot is on its own terms a really nice book.
Well, for my object lesson this week, I am dipping into the fact that I'm a bit of a bag guy. I like bags. I like backpacks. I like briefcases. I have a very nice briefcase.
You say that in the most Midwestern way. Bag guy.
I don't know what it is. Maybe it's an accent. Maybe it's the speech impediment. I'm not sure. But however I say it, I enjoy bags. I have a very nice bag I bought off eBay, a Filson briefcase that I see Alan has the same model, on his desk behind me, which we've commiserated about.
It's so good.
Celebrated
It's the best
together.
bag ever.
I love bags. And so I was very intrigued to read a super, super fascinating and charming article in the Times, yesterday or this morning. I think maybe it just been this morning, about the signature Japanese backpack that all Japanese school students wear called the Randosoru. I may be saying that right. That is absolutely fascinating. It looks like a little clamshell, like a little like cute little arc thing. It's adorable. I've seen these in like Japanese movies and cartoons, and I always assumed it was like an affectation that they illustrated into like anime thing that I happen to be watching, which I don't watch a lot of, but I've seen it occasionally. But no, this is like very much this real, very idiosyncratic design. These bags cost hundreds of dollars and students get one and then keep it throughout their entire grade school year. And almost all the students have it, even though it's not required. It's this absolutely fascinating piece, really charming, with lots of pictures of very cute Japanese students, all of whom also appear to be wearing yellow pith helmets for reasons that are not explained in the article, which I resent and wish you would do a follow-up piece, New York Times, on this. But it's really, really lovely. And I will say this is actually something that I feel like is this under-celebrated niche that the New York Times has carved out for itself, which are these little photo and written kind of culture snapshot essays of around the world, where they pick like an idiosyncratic element of a particular city or country or cultural tradition, and they do a kind of a deep dive with phenomenal photos of it. And this was just an example that really struck me. That was so interesting and completely random, not something I ever would have thought out by myself, that I really enjoyed it. So I thought I would pass along the article, the title, I should say. It's in the New York Times, and the title is The Book That Bags Japanese Society by Motoko Rich. So check that out.
Scott, I think it's the book bag that binds Japanese society, but I do like the book that bags Japanese society. That would have been a very interesting.
Wait, is that
title
what I
as
said?
Well.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I have not slept a lot lately because my children have decided to stop sleeping. I meant The Book Bag That Binds Japanese Society. Excuse me, by Motoko Rich.
So when Alan said that he was going to fill in for Quinta because Quinta was not here, I was worried that he was going to talk about how Bob Menendez is resigning from the U.S. Senate, and we are eagerly awaiting the naming of a temporary replacement by New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. But that is actually not my object lesson. I just had to squeeze that in under the wire in Quinta's absence. But I know now that people who listen to Rational Security when I am on do so for two things. One, my congressional nerdery, and two, my podcast recommendations, specifically regionally produced NPR podcasts. And I have another one for all of you this week, which is a show that is currently or was recently running under the Embedded umbrella, which is a national NPR podcast, but is coming out of Nashville Public Radio, and it's called Supermajority. It is about a group of women whose children were affected by the shooting at the Covenant School in Nashville, and sort of their sort of political response to that. And it also takes some really interesting detours into the evolution of American state legislatures, particularly in states like Tennessee, where there is large one-party dominance. We have Republicans who have the titular supermajority. So I really recommend it to folks who might be interested, both in just really well reported stories, but also in questions of sort of the evolution of Americans' politics, particularly around guns in this time period, and just more generally. So that's my recommendation for this week.
Wonderful. And speaking of people who have a reputation for bringing particular themes to our object lessons, Eugenia, I'm sure you will not disappoint. What do you have for us this week?
Okay, it falls to me to prove that not everyone affiliated to Lawfare is super well read and super smart. And so I bring another video game as my object lesson. I already mentioned this earlier during our intro, but my object lesson is Stardew Valley. You know, it's described as a cozy game, which I don't agree with as a label. I don't think that's accurate. But basically, to escape, you know, big city life, you inherit the farm, you know, your grandparents' farm, and so you move to a charming little valley, and you need to bring your farm back to life and help make everyone's lives better and fight capitalism while becoming a veggie mogul yourself. And it's quite lovely. It's addictive though. It has this function where it only saves after you finish the day, and it's super easy to just say, I'll do one more day. And then you're stuck in a loop. Like CrowdStrike.
Clever.
CrowdStrike computers. Yes. Yes.
Much like farming itself. Once you buy the farm,
much like farming itself. It does feel a little bit like a job, but it is quite lovely, and you're helping people's lives be better, and you then get a horse and you pet your, you know, bunnies, and it's quite lovely. Yeah. And it has a lovely soundtrack. So that's my object lesson.
I love it. I spend a little free time I have, I spend fantasy shopping for country homes. And so this is my nicotine patch to get me off that habit. It's a little bit of the simulation instead of the real thing. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. But Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter at RETL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter of Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan, and we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patcha. On behalf of my co-host Alan and our special guests Molly Reynolds and Eugenia Lostri, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.